I finished reading the book but didn't hurry to close it. The house was quiet, with only the wall clock lazily marking the seconds. Brandon was late, but this wasn't unusual. Work always took up a lot of his time. I reached for my phone, but there were no messages. At that moment, the headlights of a car flashed outside. I flinched. The late hour was not inviting for visits. Setting the book aside, I walked to the window. In the yard stood a car dusted with snow, and a tall figure stepped out. A person was walking towards the porch, wrapped in a long scarf. When he entered the circle of light from the street lamp, I recognized him. Andrew, Brandon's nephew, whom we hadn't seen for several months. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock. "You're unexpected," I said, not knowing how else to express my surprise. "I know." He smiled. Snow glittered on his shoulders and his breath was visible in the cold air. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. He took off his boots, unwound his scarf, and after removing his jacket, ran a tired hand through his hair. "Everything all right?" I asked, noticing how he slightly frowned. "Yeah," he nodded, but I could see something was off. I didn't ask further. Instead, I offered to take him to the kitchen. "Tea? Coffee? Or something to eat?" "Tea will be perfect." While the water boiled, I watched him as he looked around the house. It seemed the same as it was in childhood, but it no longer felt as familiar. "Been a while since you were here," I said, reminding myself more than him. "Yeah." He smiled, but there was something warm and familiar in his eyes. "It's nice to be here again." I handed him the cup. Our fingers brushed accidentally, and I felt how cold his hands were. "You're freezing." "A bit? Maybe you'd like a blanket?" "Don't worry, I'll warm up soon." He took a sip of tea and leaned back in the chair, tiredly closing his eyes. I watched him and remembered the boy who once ran around the house, laughing without a trace of tiredness. Now, the person sitting before me was someone completely different. I felt that his appearance that evening was not just a coincidence, but I still didn't know what role it would play in my life. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, holding the hot cup with both hands. The house was silent, and this silence was not awkward, but cozy, even comforting. I placed a plate with reheated dinner in front of him and sat across from him. He didn't refuse, even though he looked as though he wasn't hungry. "How was the road?" I asked, as he slowly tore the bread with his hands. "Long," he replied with a slight smile. "But I needed to come here." I didn't press him for details about what brought him here. He would tell me if he wanted to. We ate in silence, and suddenly I remembered how many years ago we sat at this same table, but everything was different. Andrew was a child, noisy, carefree, always the center of attention. I remember how he insisted that Brandon teach him to ride a bike, how he would dash out from the table to check if anything new had appeared outside, how he bombarded us with questions, not waiting for answers. But now, before me sat an adult man, calm, reserved, someone completely different. "You've changed," I said aloud, not even realizing it. Andrew looked up at me. "And you haven't," he replied quietly. I smiled, but I didn't know what to say. After dinner, I cleaned the plates and put them in the sink. He sat down on the couch, stretched his legs out, and tiredly closed his eyes. "Should I prepare the guest room for you?" I asked. "No, it's fine. I can sleep on the couch." "Nonsense, the guest room is free." I didn't wait for him to argue, just went upstairs, threw a clean blanket on the bed in the guest room, and left a glass of water on the nightstand. When I came back, he was still sitting in the same position, but now he was looking out the window. "I'm going to sleep," he said when I approached. "Good idea. You need some rest." He got up, stretched slightly, and at that moment, I felt like he wanted to say something, but changed his mind. I watched as he climbed the stairs. When Andrew disappeared into the guest room, I stayed standing in the dim light of the kitchen. For some reason, it seemed to me that something had changed in this house with his arrival. But what exactly, I didn't know yet. I woke up early. The house was quiet, with only the gentle rustling of snow outside the window. Brandon was still asleep, and I carefully got out of bed so as not to wake him. As I went downstairs, I heard strange sounds. Something was thudding softly, as if someone was fiddling with tools. I peeked into the hallway and stopped. Andrew was kneeling in front of the old cupboard, intently tightening the hinges with a screwdriver. "What are you doing?" I asked, still not understanding what was going on. "Fixing it," he simply replied, not taking his eyes off his work. I frowned. Brandon promised to do that. "I know," Andrew nodded calmly. "But since he hasn't, what difference does it make?" I didn't respond. I just watched as he confidently tightened the last screw and checked to see if the door now closed tightly. The creak was gone. I bit my lip. Brandon had been meaning to fix that cupboard for a long time, but he always postponed it. "Later," he'd say, and I had just gotten used to the slight creak as if it were inevitable. But Andrew didn't wait. He just saw the problem and decided to fix it. "Thank you," I said quietly. He looked at me as if assessing my reaction. "No problem," he replied, standing up and wiping his hands on a towel. In the kitchen, I put the kettle on and started taking out the ingredients for breakfast. "Do you drink coffee?" I asked. "Yeah, if it's strong." I nodded and silently poured him a cup. While we had breakfast, I noticed that I was glad he was here. Not because he had fixed something or helped, but because he was simply here. Calm, composed, expecting nothing in return. After breakfast, he didn't push his plate aside like Brandon would have. Instead, he just stood up and began helping me clear the table. "Are you always like this?" I asked, watching him silently wash the cups. He smiled slightly. "Like how?" "Like this." I thought for a moment, choosing my words. "Someone who doesn't wait to be asked." He paused for a moment, as if pondering my words. "Well, if something can be done, why wait?" I couldn't think of a response. That morning, for the first time, I thought about how things had changed in the house since Andrew's arrival. And it troubled me. Brandon was at work and the day promised to be long. There wasn't much to do around the house, and the weather outside looked deceptively cozy. The snow gently settled on the streets, the sky was bright, but the cold air was invigorating. "Do you want to take a trip to the center?" I suggested to Andrew when I saw him sitting with his phone, indifferently scrolling through the screen. He looked up at me as if thinking it over, then nodded. "Why not?" We parked not far from the bookstore. Lately, I hadn't come here much, but I'd always loved wandering between the shelves, finding something new. As I reached for one of the books, Andrew unexpectedly handed me another. "You once said you liked this author," he said simply. I took the book and ran my fingers over the cover. I had indeed said that. But when? A long time ago? On one of those days when he was visiting us as a child? Or maybe I'd mentioned it casually to Brandon, and Andrew happened to be the one who remembered? "Do you remember?" I asked, looking at him. He shrugged. "I just noticed." I didn't say anything in reply, but inside something shifted. We walked through the old neighborhood. I hadn't been here in a long time. The narrow streets, the small cozy cafes, the windows decorated for the new year. The air smelled of cinnamon and coffee. "Been a long time since you were in the city?" I asked as we turned toward one of the cafes. "A long time," Andrew admitted, pushing the door open and letting me go ahead. Inside it was warm. We got our coffee, sat by the window, and were silent for a while, simply warming our hands on the paper cups. "How's college?" I asked, breaking the silence. He looked at me as if deciding whether or not to answer honestly. "Sometimes I think I shouldn't have chosen it," he said at last. "Why?" He smiled wryly. "Sometimes it feels like you're following a pre-established path. Everyone around you is doing the same thing, and you're just following along." I suddenly understood what he meant. "But you made that choice yourself." "Yeah," he nodded, leaning back in his chair. "And that doesn't mean I can't reconsider it." His words struck a chord with me. I thought about myself, my life. When was the last time I reconsidered something? I had always just moved forward, as if everything were already decided for me. And you? He suddenly asked. Me? Are you happy with how everything turned out? I opened my mouth but found no answer. Outside the window, lights twinkled, people hurried on their way, and I sat across from Andrew, suddenly realizing that for the first time in a long time, I was thinking about what I actually felt. And for some reason, his question wouldn't leave my mind. By the time we got home, Brandon was already there. I heard his voice from the porch. He was talking on the phone, pacing around the living room. Yes, I'll take care of it tomorrow morning. No, it's not a problem. He quickly finished the conversation and, seeing us, smiled. Where have you been? To the center, I replied, taking off my scarf. Did you buy anything interesting? I nodded and showed him the book, but he barely glanced at it. Great. By the way, I was offered a trip for next week. His voice sounded familiar, the same confident, businesslike, slightly tired tone. I listened to him, but my thoughts were somewhere far away. For dinner, I had prepared roast meat with potatoes, and by the time we sat down at the table, the atmosphere was warm and relaxed. Andrew, do you still play basketball? Brandon asked, cutting a piece of meat. Sometimes, when I have time, he replied with a smile. Do you remember how, when you were a kid, you tried to throw the ball over the neighbor's fence and it stayed there until spring? Brandon laughed. Andrew smiled too. How could I forget that? They started reminiscing, tossing stories back and forth, and their laughter filled the kitchen. I watched them, how naturally they interacted, how easily they found common ground. At some point, I realized that I was hardly taking part in the conversation. I sat next to Brandon every day. We shared one life, one home. But when was the last time I saw him laugh like this, looking at me? I suddenly felt like an outsider at the table. I hadn't noticed this emptiness before. Or maybe I just didn't want to notice. When dinner was over, I started clearing the plates. I'll help, Andrew unexpectedly said. It's fine, I replied, but he didn't listen and grabbed a few plates. We were left alone in the kitchen while Brandon went to check the mail. Thank you for dinner, he said, placing the plates in the sink. The pleasure was mine. I smiled, but my smile felt unsure. We both fell silent, and in that silence, there was something I didn't want to analyze. I just continued washing the dishes, trying not to think about why this evening left me with such a strange sense of emptiness. I woke up early, but the house was no longer empty. Someone was moving around in the bathroom, and the sound of water came through the door. I grabbed fresh towels and, without thinking, headed that way. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open, and everything happened in a second. Andrew was standing by the sink, holding a towel in his hands, not yet having draped it over his neck. Drops of water were trickling down his face, and the light from the lamp made his features sharper. He froze. I did too. Our eyes met, and I realized that the only thing I needed to do right then was to close the door. I quickly stepped back and slammed it shut. My heart was beating so loudly that it felt like it could be heard on the other side of the door. Sorry. Andrew's muffled voice came from behind the wall. It's my fault. I thought no one was here. I quickly responded, though he had probably already gone back to what he was doing. I turned and hurried away, feeling my cheeks burn. It was just an accident. I knew that. But why couldn't that moment leave my mind? The house gradually filled with the pre-New Year's bustle. Brandon was in a good mood, discussing how to spend the holiday, and eventually suggested, let's go ice skating. The festive atmosphere, the lights, the music, it'll be great. Ice skating had never been my strong suit, but I didn't object. We arrived at the town square closer to the evening. The air was fresh, the shop windows sparkled with garlands, and the scent of hot chocolate and sweets filled the air. Around the rink, families, couples, and children were gathered, clinging to each other, laughing and falling. I put on my skates, stepped onto the ice, and immediately felt my legs betray me, slipping apart. I'm not sure this is a good idea, I muttered, trying to keep my balance. If you need help, I'll be here. Andrew's calm voice came from beside me. I didn't have time to say anything because as soon as I took a step, I nearly lost my balance. But he was quick. His hand easily grabbed my sleeve, keeping me steady. Just trust me, he said, not letting go. I took a deep breath and slowly tried to move. He didn't hold me constantly, but stayed close, ready to catch me if I wobbled. You're doing great. He smiled when I took a few hesitant steps. Well, with your help? I smirked. We skated for no more than an hour, but for the first time in a long while, I laughed wholeheartedly. After the rink, we headed to the fair. Brandon lingered at a souvenir booth, examining wooden figurines, while Andrew and I stepped aside a bit. I looked at the lights scattered around us, twinkling like warm, shimmering stars. It's beautiful here, he said softly. Yeah, I replied, continuing to admire the sparkling city. A pause fell between us, but I felt that words weren't necessary. After New Year's, I began to catch myself thinking one thing. I was thinking about Andrew too often. These thoughts came unexpectedly. When I was preparing dinner, when I heard his voice from the next room, when I was simply looking at the snow falling outside the window, I didn't know what to do about it. One evening, I went into his room to leave some clean laundry. He was sitting on the bed, looking at his phone, but hearing my footsteps, he looked up. I froze at the door. I could have just left the things and left, but something inside me wouldn't let me do that. Why do you treat me like this? I suddenly asked. My voice sounded quieter than I expected, but he heard me. Andrew looked at me as if weighing whether to tell the truth. I don't know, he finally replied. It just happened. He didn't try to justify himself or soften the situation. He just said it as it was. I walked over to the chair and sat down. I've thought about it too, I confessed. He nodded but didn't say anything. We sat like that for a few minutes, in silence, in uncertainty, in the understanding that what had been said couldn't be changed. Then I stood up. Good night, I said, not looking him in the eye. Good night, he replied quietly. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it with my back. I needed to forget this conversation, but I knew I wouldn't be able to. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I just thought that fatigue had accumulated. The holidays, the bustle, the cold. Then came the weakness. Sometimes it felt like my head was spinning more than it should, but I chalked it all up to lack of sleep. And then came the morning when I threw up. I woke up early. Brandon was still asleep, his breathing steady and calm. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake him, and went to the kitchen. But as soon as I inhaled the smell of coffee, I felt nauseous. I threw up right into the sink. I gripped the edge of the sink, trying to steady myself, but fear was already creeping inside. This can't be happening. I took a deep breath, rinsed my mouth, and trying not to think of the worst, poured black tea into a cup. But the unease had already settled within me. 2 days later, when I went to the pharmacy, I hoped until the very last moment that it was all just a coincidence. The cashier didn't even look at me, just scanned the pregnancy test and handed me the bag. Do you need the receipt? She asked. No, thank you, I replied, hiding the purchase in my pocket. When I left the pharmacy, my legs felt like jelly. The cold air burned my skin, but I barely felt it. I walked to the car, sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine right away. None of this felt real. It was just a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. At home, I locked myself in the bathroom. I placed the test on the sink, looked at it, and took a deep breath. As if holding my breath could slow down the inevitable. I followed the instructions and set the test on the edge of the sink. Now, all that was left was to wait. 3 minutes. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. Then to 20. Then I just froze, listening to the ticking of the clock somewhere in the distance. I didn't want to look. I was scared. But whatever it was, reality wouldn't change now. I opened my eyes, looked down, and my heart dropped somewhere into an abyss. 2 lines. I slowly sank onto the edge of the bathtub, pressing my face into my hands. This was impossible. But the 2 clear lines told a different story. I gritted my teeth, trying to hold on to reality. Who is the father? That question burned me from within. Brandon? Andrew? I didn't know. I tried to count the days, trace when it could have happened, but all I had in my head was confusion. I clenched my fingers into fists. No, I couldn't panic. I couldn't think about the worst. But how could I not, when everything inside me was already torn apart by fear? I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A pale face, eyes filled with confusion. What do I do? How do I live with this now? I stood up, crumpled the test package, and threw it in the trash can. Then I carefully wrapped the test itself in paper and hid it in the medicine cabinet, as if that could change anything. But nothing changed. I took a deep breath. I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't admit it. I couldn't even allow myself a hint of doubt. Brandon couldn't know. Andrew couldn't know. No one could know. I made my decision. And from that day on, I would have to learn to live with this secret. Andrew left for home a few days later. We said goodbye on the porch, and I held back the trembling in my hands, not wanting to show even the slightest sign of emotion. He simply smiled, gave my hand a firm shake, and waved at me through the window of his car. I watched him drive away, feeling both relief and unease. But whatever it was, I knew I couldn't tell the truth. Brandon was over the moon with happiness. He had long dreamed of having a child, and now that the news was clear, he became even more caring and attentive. He brought me tea, checked if I needed anything. He started making plans. He talked about the nursery, the stroller, the future. He talked so much, and I remained silent so often. I looked at Brandon, at his kind eyes full of expectation, and couldn't say a word. He was so happy. His confidence, his love. All of it was real, but it still hurt. I felt like I was betraying him, living with this secret. He was making plans for the future, and I couldn't think about what would happen if he ever found out the truth. I didn't know what to do with this secret, how to carry it through life. I didn't know if I could live with it, but I couldn't choose another path. At that moment, I made a decision. Brandon was thrilled when he found out about the pregnancy. He became more caring, more attentive, as though he knew I needed more support than before. He did everything to make me feel good, to keep me from worrying, to ease my mind. But inside me was this dark, oppressive thought that none of it mattered, that all our plans, all our dreams, they would be destroyed if he knew who the real father was. Every time he smiled and touched my belly, saying that soon he would be holding our child in his arms, I felt my heart tighten. I had to hide it. I couldn't afford the slightest mistake. I made my choice. I would remain silent. I would keep this secret. It would be hard, but maybe this way would be better. I couldn't let everything fall apart. I couldn't leave Brandon. I couldn't hurt him. But I also couldn't destroy what had begun between me and Andrew. I knew that this connection between us would never disappear, that it would stay deep inside, even if I pretended nothing had happened. But if I told the truth, everything would change. It wouldn't be easy. I lay awake at night, looking out the window. Brandon was quietly snoring beside me, his breathing steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling, as though I was hiding something, as though it was something inevitably destructive. I ran my hand over my stomach, feeling it move slightly, and I found it hard to breathe. It was my secret, my burden, and I knew it would stay with me forever. With each passing day, the weight grew more tangible. But I couldn't change anything. I had made my choice, and perhaps I would live with it until the end. Time passed, and I learned to pretend. I smiled when Brandon, with shining eyes, talked about how he imagined our child. He would stroke my belly, imagining how one day he would hold the baby in his arms. He was happy, and I was supposed to be happy too. But inside, everything was screaming. I lived with a secret that ate away at me from the inside, day after day. I woke up earlier than everyone else and spent a long time looking at myself in the mirror. In the darkness of the bedroom, in the morning light of the bathroom. It didn't matter where. I tried to find in my reflection the woman who could bear this burden. The woman who could never tell the truth. The woman who would learn to live with it as if it meant nothing. But I couldn't find her. Every time Brandon talked about the future, I felt my chest tighten. He spoke so confidently, with such joy, with such impatience that it hurt. Because I knew the future he was painting was built on a lie. But he could never know the truth. I decided that back then, the day I saw the 2 lines, I decided that no one would ever find out. No one. One evening, when Brandon was already asleep, I sat by the window and looked out at the street. The snow continued to fall. White, pure, flawless. Just like how I didn't feel. I ran my hand over my stomach. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I didn't know to whom these words were addressed. To myself? To the child? To Brandon or to Andrew? I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I could carry this burden for the rest of my life. But I had no choice. I made it a long time ago. And now all I had left to do was live with a secret I would never tell anyone. Time passed, and I had to get used to living with a secret. The pregnancy became more noticeable, and along with it grew the feeling that I was living in some foreign world. Brandon was happy. He read books about parenting, picked out furniture for the nursery, and suggested names, trying to figure out which one would suit our son or daughter. I nodded, smiled, pretending I was living this moment too. But inside it was different. Every night when I was alone in the dark, my thoughts turned back to Andrew. What would he say if he knew? How would he react? Would he want to stay in this child's life? But I knew it was pointless to ask myself those questions. He had left. It was all over. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. One evening, the phone rang. I was in the kitchen, sorting through fresh fruit, when I heard Brandon pick up the receiver. "Andrew, yeah, long time no hear." My husband's voice was filled with genuine joy. "How are you?" My fingers froze on the orange peel of a mandarin. Andrew. I hadn't heard his voice, but his name seemed to echo inside me. I held my breath. "Yeah, of course." "Come by when you're in town," Brandon continued. No, don't worry. We'd be happy to see you." The world contracted into one point. He's coming. My hands involuntarily clenched, my nails digging into the mandarin peel. I thought I would never see him again. That this part of my life was in the past. But the past was knocking on my door again. I couldn't sleep all night. Thoughts swirled in my mind like scattered puzzle pieces that couldn't be put together. Andrew was coming back into our lives. He would walk into this house, sit at this table, look at me, and see it all. Everything. I felt it deep inside. When Brandon said that Andrew would stop by over the weekend, my mouth went dry. "Are you happy?" he asked, not noticing how tightly I was gripping the cup of tea. "Of course." I managed to squeeze out with a smile that seemed like it would crack if I moved my lips. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let anything slip. When I heard the sound of a car pulling up on Saturday, panic overtook me. I stood in the kitchen making tea and realized I couldn't bring myself to walk into the living room. A deep breath, a slow exhale. It will be okay. But as soon as I took a step toward the hallway, I heard Brandon's voice. "Andrew, come in. We're so happy to see you." And then, another voice. Low, calm, a little hoarse. "Glad to be here again." I froze for a second, then grabbed the tray with cups and walked into the living room. And there he was. Andrew was standing by the door, brushing snow off his coat. He looked almost the same as that evening when he had appeared at the doorstep, but there was something different in his gaze. When he raised his eyes and met mine, I knew that he knew. He held his gaze on me a little longer than necessary, and then looked at my stomach. I clenched my fingers around the tray handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I couldn't panic. I couldn't give myself away. "Andrew," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Hello?" he replied, and that one short word was enough to make the air in the room feel heavy, like before a storm. I placed the tray on the table and forced myself to look away. But even without looking, I could feel his gaze on me. He knew, but he didn't say a word. The whole evening, I avoided meeting his eyes. Brandon told stories, laughed, unaware of the strange tension that hung in the air. I stood up, brought snacks, pretended that everything was fine. But I knew. He was waiting for when we would be alone. And when that finally happened, when Brandon went into the study to answer a call, I felt everything inside me tighten. We were left alone. The silence between us was almost deafening. I stood by the sink, my back to him, gripping a glass of water. I heard him get up from the couch. I heard him step closer. And then the quiet, calm, but loaded question. "Is this my child?" I closed my eyes. Inhale. Exhale. I knew this moment would come. But I didn't know how to answer. I felt cold fingers tighten around my heart as his words hung in the air. It wasn't a loud accusation. It wasn't a question filled with anger or judgment. He asked quietly, calmly, as if seeking confirmation of something he already knew. I didn't turn around. "Andrew?" I barely exhaled, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not that simple." He stepped even closer, and I felt his presence surround me like a wave. He was close, but didn't touch me. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was quiet, but there was no anger, no resentment, only pain. I exhaled, feeling the tears begin to catch in my throat. I didn't want to show them. I needed to be strong. I couldn't. "You don't understand," I said, pressing the glass to my lips to hide the trembling in my hands. "You think I wouldn't understand?" He interrupted softly. "You think I would turn my back on this child?" I closed my eyes, tilting my head back, and felt the tears start to roll down my cheeks. I couldn't stop them. "Brandon." I barely held my voice together when I spoke his name. He's been waiting for this child. I can't ruin his life. He does so much for me. He loves me. I can't hurt him." I felt Andrew step closer, and now his breath was barely audible. I didn't turn around, didn't want to look him in the eye because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to hide all my pain. "I'm not asking you to destroy your life," he said softly. "I just want you to be honest with yourself. With him. With this child. Too many words. Too much pain.